Hello, economic students. Today we're going to talk about fiscal policy, and I've got this picture up here for a reason. This is Washington, D.C., and you can see in this picture in the foreground, here's the White House, and from the White House I can drive down Pennsylvania Avenue and get over here to the United States Capitol building. Fiscal policy is controlled by the President of the United States, represented by the White House, and Congress, which is represented by the Capitol building. So that's why I have this here, fiscal policy, the President and Congress, as opposed to monetary policy, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve. So today we're focusing on fiscal policy, so let's get started. First of all, the definition of fiscal policy is managing the economy through tax policy and government spending. Now, I'm going to go pretty fast through this presentation, so you'll probably want to pause every now and then to get your notes completed. You'll just pause and write what you need to write and then start up again. So I will be able to go fairly fast through the presentation. The goal, of course, in fiscal policy is full employment and low inflation. It's the same goal that we had in monetary policy, but we just address it in a different way. Fiscal policy is recommended by the President's Council of Economic Advisors. This is composed of 3 economists who are typically from our elite universities, schools of economics, but they can also come from private industry as well. But each president typically has 3 very elite economists on his council who advise him on fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is oftentimes called Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics is getting that name from John Maynard Keynes, who I believe we have discussed a little bit in the class already. John Maynard Keynes was in the middle of the 20th century. Prior to John Maynard Keynes, governments rarely got involved proactively in the economy. But that all changed in the 1930s with the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt was highly influenced by the writings of John Maynard Keynes, who believed that the government had a very proactive role to play in helping economies recover from severe recessions or depressions such as we had in the 1930s. Excuse me there. So I like this quote. You don't have to write this down, but Keynes said the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. And in his case, the old idea was that the government should keep its hands off the economy. And that clearly has not been the case since the 1930s and Roosevelt's New Deal, which was based on Keynesian economics as an attempt to pull us out of the Great Depression. Keynes said that the government does in fact play an important role in managing the economy through its taxes and spending. So let's take a look at expansionary fiscal policy and how that would work under Keynesian economics. First of all, an expansionary policy is used to fight a recession. It consists of more government spending, reduced taxes, or both. Expansionary fiscal policy usually will result in a budget deficit. So let's take a look at how this works from a tax perspective. So, from increasing government spending, not so much from taxing, but from the government spending aspect. The purpose will be to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, so we're going to spend more money in the government. A multiplier effect will increase the aggregate demand beyond what the government directly contributes. Now let me explain what all this means. By aggregate demand, I simply meant the demand for all the goods and services that our economy produces. And as the government spends more money, that's going to increase demand for goods and services. So for example, if we need to build a bunch of roads and bridges in our economy, the government's going to pay a company to build those roads and bridges. That company in turn will have to pay new workers. It will hire new workers and pay those workers an income. Those workers will spend their money at other businesses to buy goods and services that they want. And then those other businesses will get money from those government employees, They in turn will hire new people and they will have to make more stuff. And you can see it's sort of a snowball effect. This increased government spending flows through the entire economy. And in fact, what happens is for every dollar that the government spends, you can expect there to be about $4 to $5 more in growth in the economy, that is in economic activity, as a result of this increased government spending. Every dollar that the government spends typically increases economic activity by about $4 to $5. Unemployment then will fall as firms respond to that rightward shift in aggregate demand. As people want more stuff, companies will start hiring more people, and ideally that should pull us out of the recession. Let's look at the tax reduction aspect of this. Tax reductions increase consumer spending. A multiplier will also increase the spending significantly more than the actual amount of the tax reduction. So just as there was a multiplier with government spending, there will also be a multiplier in tax reduction as people get more disposable income to spend on goods and services. Interestingly, though, tax reductions don't add as much money to the economy as government spending does. Why do you think that's the case? Well, let's think about it. If you were to get a big break on taxes, let's say you get a big tax refund of, a couple of $1,000s, are you automatically going to spend that entire tax refund? You probably not. What's probably going to happen, a portion of the money that you have as a result of a tax reduction will be saved by you and by other households. Whereas government spending, it's spending 100% of that fiscal stimulus, but with tax reductions, some of that fiscal stimulus is saved, so it doesn't increase the overall flow of money in the economy as much as government spending does. We all enjoy a tax reduction, and it is effective in fiscal policy, but not quite as effective as government spending is. Here's a supply and demand curve, or a supply and demand model that shows the effect of expansionary policy. And basically, if you look at this graph, you can see that aggregate demand has shifted to the right, and that has caused us to have a new equilibrium quantity and price. We go from E1 to E2. And notice the quantity at Q2 down below. When we increased our aggregate demand, we have a greater quantity of goods and services being demanded. And with that greater quantity of goods and services, companies hopefully will hire more people, and the economy will pull itself out of a recessionary cycle. Okay, let's look at contractionary fiscal policy. It's used to respond to demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation, that's simply inflation where the demand for goods and services is growing faster than productivity, or than the supply of goods and services. When demand grows more than supply, you're going to have inflation, and that's a type of inflation called demand pull inflation, which is the most common type of inflation. In this situation, the government may reduce spending, raise taxes, or both. In other words, it's the opposite of what it did in expansionary fiscal policy. Under a contractionary policy, the federal budget should move towards a surplus. Now, in reality, that doesn't often happen. Our government, federal government that is, has not had a surplus since the 1990s. So we've gone for more than 20 years with a budget deficit, and in that period of time we have had periods of a good economy. So we don't really follow Keynesian economics as we should probably, because we do rarely go into surplus. We're usually running a deficit. What happens though is sometimes the deficit is more than it is at other times based on the condition of the economy at the time. Oops. Sorry about that. Here's a supply and demand graph that shows the effect of contractionary fiscal policy. And again, it's just the opposite of what we saw with expansionary policy. Here we have aggregate demand 1 shifting to the left. So we have less disposable income to spend. The government is spending less money, and therefore demand has shifted. We're not buying as much stuff. Quantities are going to decrease, and prices are going to go down as well. So this should be anti-inflationary this decrease in aggregate demand should push prices down, which should pull us out of an inflationary cycle. And that, of course, is the goal then of contractionary policy. Now, in our economy, we have something called sticky prices. Sticky prices simply mean that sometimes prices don't respond to changes in supply and demand immediately, that there's a stickiness to the prices. So even if aggregate demand should shift to the left, sometimes that lower demand will not cause prices to shift. They'll stay high. So again, if you reduce spending, it should shift demand to the left, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the economy the prices will stay where they were, or they won't shift as much as you would think they would. That's what we call sticky prices. And sticky prices mean that aggregate prices in the economy would be higher than the equilibrium. And I have here what is the result. The result is because prices don't automatically shift downward, which should make, if we're making less money, if the prices shift downward, that shouldn't be a big deal. But if prices stay high, and they tend to do that because companies don't like to reduce prices, what will happen is you will get a surplus of goods and services. And a surplus eventually is going to lead companies to start laying people off. So, that contractionary policy does always carry the danger of higher unemployment and potentially, recessions if it lasts for very long. I want to close out looking at something called fiscal stabilizers. A stabilizer is anything that increases a budget deficit during a recession or a budget surplus during inflation. This is the goal of fiscal policy, to increase deficits in a recession or budget surpluses during inflation. In our system, we have progressive income taxes. The higher the GDP, the greater the tax rate will be, because people are making more money. And as GDP grows, people have higher incomes, and at higher income levels, they'll pay higher tax rates. That's progressive income tax, which we discussed a few days ago. Progressive taxes are anti-inflationary during periods of inflation. Think about it. You're paying a higher percentage of your income in taxes. Therefore, that's going to reduce this demand pull inflation. It will reduce the amount of disposable income you have as a percentage of your total income to spend on stuff. It will tend, therefore, to reduce that demand pull inflation. In a recession, it's the opposite. Progressive tax rates go down as people make less income, so their disposable income as a percent of their total income will increase. So prices go down, your income goes down, but your tax rate is less as well. So the taxes that you spend will go down more than the reduction in your income, and that should also help to ensure that we're spending more money and pulling out of a recession. So with that, I'm going to stop this presentation. If you need to rewind and watch it again to make sure you got all your notes, please do so. And that's it for today. Just check and see if there's any assignment in Canvas. Thanks a lot.